A millionaire's party invite raised eyebrows, until his accountant finally appeared. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. He stands alone near the edge of the ballroom, a crystal glass of water, untouched in his hand. Around him, the party hums with quiet confidence. Laughter is controlled. Conversations are measured. Every person in this room knows exactly who they are and what they are worth. His name is Daniel Wright. To the outside world, Daniel is a self-made millionaire, a man who built a financial empire before 40, a man whose decisions move markets, and whose signature closes deals worth tens of millions of dollars. But tonight, none of that is what people are whispering about. They are whispering about one question: where is she? Earlier that evening, Daniel had done something unexpected, something that did not fit the carefully polished image his business partners were used to. He had sent out the invitation, not to a model, not to a socialite, not to a politician's daughter or a hedge fund heiress. He invited his accountant. When the invitation first circulated, people assumed it was a joke. Then the confirmations came in, the guest list was finalized, and the truth became impossible to ignore. Daniel Wright was bringing his accountant to the most important party of the year. Now, the room is full. The chandeliers glow softly overhead. The men wear tailored suits that cost more than some people make in a year. The women glide across the marble floor, in gowns designed to be seen and remembered. Daniel's partners gather nearby, pretending not to stare in his direction, pretending not to smile. They do not mock him openly. They are far too polished for that. Instead, they exchange looks, raised eyebrows, half smiles hidden behind glasses of wine. One of them leans in and speaks just loud enough to be heard. "An accountant," he says, amused. "That is a bold choice." Another chuckles softly. "I admire the confidence, or maybe the lack of it." Daniel hears them. Of course he does. He hears everything, but he does not respond. He simply checks his watch. She is late. Not fashionably late, just late enough for the room to begin drawing its own conclusions. They assume she is overwhelmed. They assume she realized she does not belong here. They assume Daniel has finally miscalculated. What none of them understand is this: Daniel did not invite her to impress anyone. He invited her because when his company was on the brink of collapse, when investors walked away and partners protected themselves, she stayed. She stayed late. She stayed honest. She stayed calm when the numbers were ugly and the future uncertain. And that, to Daniel, mattered more than appearances. Still, as the minutes pass, even he feels the weight of the room pressing in. Every second she is not here turns curiosity into judgment. Then, at last, the doors at the far end of the ballroom begin to open. The music softens. Conversations trail off, and slowly, without announcement or fanfare, she steps inside. Long before the first guest arrived, long before the chandeliers were lit and the champagne was poured, Daniel Wright already knew this night would not be easy. This party was not about celebration. It was about survival. For months, Daniel's company had been under quiet scrutiny, not from the public, from people far more dangerous, his own partners, the investors who smiled in meetings and voted with their wallets in private, the ones who believed success should look a certain way, sound a certain way, and arrive with the right kind of person on your arm. They did not question his numbers. Those were solid. They did not question his intelligence. That was undeniable. They questioned his stability. A man without a visible personal life. A man who never brought a guest. A man who did not fit neatly into their expectations. In their world, appearances were not shallow. They were currency. This party was a test, not written down, not spoken aloud, but understood by everyone in the room. Show us that you belong. Show us that you can play the game. Show us that you are not a risk. Daniel understood the rules. He always had. But this time, he refused to play them the way they expected. Because when the company nearly collapsed 3 years earlier, when a failed expansion drained cash, and a lawsuit threatened to sink everything he built, none of these people stood beside him. They protected themselves. Only one person stayed. She was not loud. She was not flashy. She did not offer false comfort. She brought spreadsheets, long nights, uncomfortable truths. As his accountant, she had been the first to tell him how bad things really were, and the last to leave the office when the work was done. She did not flatter him. She did not panic. She did not walk away. When banks hesitated and partners distanced themselves, she helped him restructure debt, cut losses, and rebuild trust line by line, number by number, quietly, relentlessly. Daniel never forgot that, so when the invitation for the party came, with its unspoken expectations and silent judgments, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He invited the one person he trusted, not as a statement, not as a rebellion, but as the truth. Still, truth comes with consequences. As the evening unfolded, Daniel felt the pressure mount with every glance in his direction. The room did not forgive deviation easily. Each minute she was not there fed the narrative forming around him, that he was careless, that he had misjudged the moment, that he had finally overestimated his independence. Daniel stood tall, but inside, he measured the risk. If she walked in and faltered, they would never forget it. If she appeared uncomfortable, they would use it as proof. If she did not meet their standards, they would quietly question his leadership. This was not fair, but fairness was not part of the game. And yet, Daniel waited, because inviting her was not about winning tonight. It was about refusing to pretend. Across town, she stood in front of a mirror, smoothing the fabric of a dress she had chosen carefully. Not to impress, not to compete, but to remain herself. She knew what this room would be like. She knew what these people would see when they looked at her. And still, she came, not for the spotlight, not for approval, but because Daniel had asked, and because when everything else had been unstable, numbers had not lied. People had. The doors were about to open, and with them, the truth Daniel had chosen was about to step into the room. They had never planned this moment in detail. There was no contract, no rehearsed dialogue, no list of rules written down and signed. What existed between them was simpler, and in some ways, far more fragile. Trust. Earlier that evening, before the city lights began to glow, and before the music filled the ballroom, Daniel had stood in his office, jacket draped over a chair, tie still loose around his collar. The windows behind him reflected a man who looked calm, composed, and entirely in control. Inside, he was anything but. She stood near the door, hands folded in front of her, posture straight. She did not pace. She did not fidget. She waited, the same way she always did before difficult conversations. Daniel broke the silence first. "You do not have to do this," he said evenly. "You can still walk away." She met his gaze, not defiantly, not nervously, just honestly. "I know," she replied, "but that is not why I am here." He nodded once. That was what he expected her to say. He took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "There will be people tonight who assume things," he continued. "They will judge you before you speak. They will decide who you are without asking." "I am used to that," she said quietly. Daniel hesitated, then added, "You do not owe them anything. You do not owe me anything either." That was the line, the boundary, the invisible line neither of them intended to cross. This was not a performance. This was not a promise. And it was certainly not romance. It was a single evening, one appearance, one shared space, nothing more. She nodded in agreement. "I am not here to impress anyone," she said. "I am here to stand beside you. That is all." Something in her voice steadied him. They spoke briefly about logistics, where to stand, when to arrive, what to expect. Not in detail, not like a strategy session, just enough to remove uncertainty. No pretending to be someone else. No exaggerated stories, no false intimacy, just honesty, quiet and firm. Before they left, she reached out and adjusted his tie. The gesture was small, practical, almost absent-minded, but it grounded him. As they rode toward the venue, the city passing by in streaks of light, neither of them spoke much. There was nothing left to say. Everything that mattered had already been understood. Now, back in the present, as the ballroom doors finished opening and the music swelled again, that unspoken agreement followed them into the room. She stepped inside with measured confidence, not because she felt powerful, but because she refused to shrink. She did not scan the crowd. She did not search for approval. She walked as someone who knew why she was there, Daniel saw it instantly. The room did not react the way it usually did. There was no immediate applause, no gasps, just a subtle shift, a recalibration. People adjusted their posture. Conversations paused mid-sentence. This was not the image they expected. She was not extravagant. She was not timid. She was composed. Daniel moved toward her, meeting her halfway across the floor. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. When he reached her side, he offered his arm. Not as a signal, not as a claim, as a choice. She accepted. And together, they stepped fully into the room, carrying nothing but the truth they had agreed to share. For the first time that night, the whispers stopped. Not because judgment had ended, but because uncertainty had begun. Once they stepped fully into the ballroom, the night began to move faster. Daniel guided her through the crowd with calm precision, not shielding her, not displaying her, simply walking beside her, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. People turned as they passed, some curious, some skeptical, some openly surprised. Introductions followed. One by one, Daniel's partners extended polite smiles and measured handshakes. They addressed her with professional courtesy, but their eyes betrayed their assumptions. They expected awkwardness, hesitation, a misstep. She gave them none. She introduced herself clearly, her voice steady, her posture relaxed. She did not overshare. She did not apologize for being there. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, her words were intentional. It unsettled them. At the bar, a senior investor asked her what she did. "I manage numbers," she replied simply, "and I tell the truth about them." The man laughed, assuming it was a joke. Daniel did not. As the evening progressed, conversations shifted naturally toward business. That was inevitable. In this room, small talk was just a doorway to leverage. A group formed near one of the tall cocktail tables. 4 partners, Daniel and her. They discussed market volatility, regulatory pressure, a recent acquisition that had not performed as expected. Daniel listened, so did she. When one partner confidently referenced projected margins, she hesitated for just a moment, not to interrupt, to confirm. Then she spoke. "That projection assumes supplier stability that no longer exists," she said calmly. "The margin looks strong on paper, but the risk exposure is higher than it appears." The table fell quiet. One man frowned. "Those numbers came from our advisory firm." "I know," she replied. "I reviewed them last quarter." She did not challenge him. She corrected the information. Another partner asked a follow-up question, sharper this time, testing her. She answered without defensiveness, without ego. Daniel watched the shift happen in real time. The laughter faded. The smiles tightened. Interest replaced amusement. This was not the role they had prepared for. Across the room, whispers resumed. But they sounded different now, less dismissive, more curious. Daniel felt it. The tension he had carried all evening loosened slightly. Not because he had been validated, but because she had not needed his validation at all. They moved again, greeting more guests. Each interaction reinforced the same truth. She belonged here not because of how she looked, but because of what she brought. Later, as the music softened and the crowd spread out, Daniel and she found themselves momentarily alone near a quiet corner of the room. "You are doing well," he said quietly. She glanced at him, surprised by the comment. "I am not performing," she replied. "I am just being accurate." He smiled, just slightly. "That is why it works." She considered that, then nodded. From across the ballroom, one of the more influential partners watched them closely. Not with ridicule this time, with calculation. The test was not over, but the narrative had changed. They had arrived as a question. Now, they were becoming an answer. The shift did not happen all at once. It started quietly, in the way real power always does. A few steps away, Daniel noticed something he had not seen before. His partners were no longer watching her out of curiosity. They were listening, leaning in, recalculating. One of them, a man who rarely spoke without purpose, addressed her directly. "You mentioned risk exposure earlier," he said. "How would you handle it if the market tightens next quarter?" The question was not polite. It was deliberate, a test. She did not answer immediately. She took a moment, not to think, but to frame the truth in a way they could hear. "I would not react emotionally," she said. "I would slow down spending, renegotiate short-term obligations, and protect liquidity before chasing growth. Someone scoffed softly. That sounds conservative. It is, she replied. Conservative keeps companies alive. Silence followed. Daniel felt it again, that subtle change in the room, the invisible recalibration of respect. This was no longer about him bringing the wrong person. This was about them realizing they had underestimated the right one. A waiter passed with a tray of drinks. She declined with a small shake of her head. Focused, present, grounded. Another partner joined the circle, his tone measured. You speak as if you have been in crisis before. I have, she answered, with this company. That caught their attention. She did not dramatize it. She did not seek sympathy. She stated it as fact. When expansion costs exceeded projections, when lenders pulled back, and when internal confidence dropped, she continued, we survived because decisions were made early, not because they were popular. Daniel watched the faces around her change. These men prided themselves on foresight, on control, on knowing what others did not. And here stood someone who had already walked through the storm they pretended not to remember. Across the room, conversations slowed. People were paying attention now. Not just to her words, but to Daniel. They were reassessing him too. Not the man who invited his accountant. The man who trusted the right voice when it mattered. Daniel felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest. Not pride. Something steadier. Something deeper. Respect. Not from the room. For her. As the discussion wound down, one of the senior partners raised his glass slightly. To clarity, he said, it is rarer than confidence. She acknowledged the gesture with a nod, nothing more. When the group dispersed, Daniel and she found themselves alone again, standing near the same corner as before. You just changed the tone of the entire night, Daniel said quietly. She exhaled, just a little, the first sign of tension leaving her shoulders. I did not intend to, she replied. I only answered honestly. He looked at her then, really looked at her, not as his accountant, not as his guest, not as a role he had assigned, as someone who had just stood her ground in a room designed to break people. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The music continued. The party resumed. But something irreversible had already happened. The room had made its judgment, and it was not the one they expected. The real test was no longer whether she belonged. It was whether Daniel had the courage to stand beside her when the consequences arrived. Because now, everyone was watching. The noise of the party faded the farther they moved from the center of the room. Daniel guided her toward a quieter balcony overlooking the city, where the glass doors muted the music and softened the laughter behind them. Outside, the night air was cool and steady, a contrast to the charged atmosphere inside. For the first time since she arrived, neither of them was being watched. Daniel rested his hands lightly on the railing, looking out at the skyline. The city lights stretched for miles, sharp and endless, much like the expectations placed on him. You did not have to step into that, he said at last. His voice was calm, but something beneath it had shifted. She stood beside him, not too close, not distant either. I chose to, she replied. No one forced me. He turned slightly, studying her expression. There was no trace of triumph on her face, no satisfaction, only focus, giving way to quiet composure. They were not easy on you, he said. They were not meant to be, she answered. That is how those rooms work. Daniel exhaled slowly. I invited you knowing what they would do. That is on me. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and shook her head. You invited me because you trusted me, she said. That matters more than their opinions. The words landed heavier than either of them expected. Inside, Daniel felt something loosen. A tension he had carried for years, not just tonight. The constant calculation, the constant need to anticipate judgment. You never seem afraid of it, he said. The pressure, the scrutiny. She smiled faintly, not with amusement, but with understanding. I am afraid, she said. I just do not let it decide for me. Silence followed, comfortable and unguarded. Below them, traffic moved steadily, indifferent to power and reputation. For a moment, the world felt simpler. Daniel broke the quiet again. When I asked you to come tonight, he said, I told myself it was just one evening, one appearance, nothing more. She nodded. That is what we agreed. But, he continued, choosing his words carefully, I do not think I expected how much it would mean to stand next to someone who does not pretend. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she folded her arms lightly against the night air. "I have spent my career making sure other people look good," she said. "It is strange to realize I was never supposed to disappear while doing it." Daniel felt that. He had built an empire on visibility, yet the person who helped protect it had always remained invisible by design. "I am sorry for that," he said quietly. She turned toward him, surprised. "For what?" "For benefiting from your silence," he said, "and never asking what it cost you." The honesty of the moment surprised them both. She considered his words, then softened slightly. "I chose my role," she said, "but I am allowed to outgrow it." Daniel met her gaze. There was no performance now, no agreement to hide behind. Just two people standing at the edge of a realization neither had planned. From inside the ballroom, the doors opened briefly. A burst of laughter spilled out, followed by voices calling Daniel's name. The world was pulling him back. He hesitated. Then he said something he had not intended to say. "Stay close tonight," he said. "Not because of them, because I want you there." She searched his face, weighing the meaning carefully. "I can do that," she said, "as long as we are honest about what it is." He nodded. "So can I." They returned inside together, side by side, no longer bound by an unspoken arrangement, but by a growing awareness neither of them could ignore. The fake boundary they had drawn earlier was still there, but for the first time, it felt fragile, and everyone in the room could sense it. The moment they stepped back into the ballroom, Daniel felt it. The attention had sharpened. What had once been casual observation was now focused interest. Eyes followed them as they moved through the room together. Conversations lowered when they passed. People were no longer whispering out of amusement. They were watching for weakness. Across the room, Richard Hale stood with a small group of senior partners. Richard had been with the firm longer than Daniel, longer than most. He smiled often, spoke softly, and never forgot a slight. Richard had noticed everything. He watched how the room shifted when she spoke. He watched how Daniel looked at her now, and he understood exactly what it meant. Daniel was changing the balance. Richard excused himself from his group and approached with a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. "Daniel," he said warmly, "there you are. I was hoping to speak with you." Daniel turned, already guarded. "Of course." Richard's gaze flicked briefly to her, then back to Daniel. "And this must be the accountant everyone is talking about," Richard added. His tone was pleasant, almost admiring. She met his gaze evenly. "Good evening." Richard nodded. "I have heard impressive things." Daniel knew that tone, compliments that came before conditions. "We were just discussing the upcoming restructuring," Richard continued. "Perhaps you would care to join us at the main table. It would be helpful to hear your perspective, publicly." The word landed heavily. Publicly. Daniel recognized the move instantly. This was not inclusion. This was exposure. He looked at her, giving her the choice. She saw it too. "If that is useful," she said calmly, "I am willing." They joined the table moments later. The room subtly reorganized itself. Chairs shifted. Attention gathered. What had once been a celebration was quietly transforming into a stage. Richard stood, glass in hand. "Since we are fortunate enough to have such insight with us tonight," he said, smiling to the room, "I thought it might be helpful to address a concern some of our partners have raised." Daniel stiffened. Richard continued smoothly. "Recent decisions have been unconventional, some might say risky. Inviting internal staff into spaces traditionally reserved for leadership discussions is one example." The implication was clear. This was no longer about numbers. This was about hierarchy. "Perhaps," Richard said, turning to her, "you could explain why you believe such involvement is appropriate." The room was silent now. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Daniel felt anger rise, sharp and immediate. He stepped forward. "That is unnecessary," he said firmly. But she placed a hand lightly on his arm, not to stop him, to steady him. "I can answer," she said. Richard inclined his head. "Please." She looked around the table, meeting each gaze without flinching. "I believe decisions improve when those closest to the data are heard," she said. "Titles do not change facts. Ignoring information because of where it comes from increases risk." Richard smiled thinly. "That sounds idealistic." "No," she replied. "It sounds practical." A murmur rippled through the table. Richard pressed on. And yet, some might argue that boundaries exist for a reason. They do, she agreed. To protect egos, not outcomes. The room froze. Daniel felt the weight of it. The line had been crossed, not by her, by the game itself. Richard's smile vanished. Be careful, he said quietly. This company was not built on sentiment. She held his gaze. It was built on truth, she said. Sentiment only reveals who forgets that. Silence stretched. Richard turned back to the table, glass lowering. Well, he said after a moment, I suppose we will see which approach holds. He stepped away, conversation resuming slowly behind him. But the damage was done. Daniel knew it. Richard had drawn a line in public, and lines drawn in rooms like this were never harmless. As Daniel looked at her, he understood the cost of standing beside her now. This was no longer about one evening. The real conflict had begun. The room did not return to normal after Richard Hale walked away. It pretended to. Laughter resumed, but it sounded thinner. Conversations restarted, but they stayed cautious. Everyone knew something had shifted, even if no one said it out loud. Daniel felt it in the way people now approached him, more carefully, more deliberately. Not as a certainty, but as a variable. And at the center of that uncertainty stood her. She remained calm, outwardly unchanged, but Daniel could sense the focus sharpening in her. The same focus she had when numbers refused to balance and time was running out. A senior partner approached moments later, holding a tablet. Since the topic is already open, the man said, perhaps we should address the restructuring directly. Richard's challenge had opened a door. Now the room wanted to see what would walk through it. The partner turned the screen so others could see. Charts, projections, assumptions built on optimistic growth. This is the framework we plan to present to the board next week, he explained. It assumes aggressive expansion starting in the third quarter. Daniel recognized the plan. He had approved it tentatively, before tonight. She studied the numbers quietly. No interruption, no commentary, just observation. Then she spoke. This model depends on uninterrupted credit access, she said. If interest rates rise even slightly, debt servicing will strain cash flow within 6 months. A few heads tilted. That had not been mentioned earlier. She continued, steady and precise. There is a safer alternative. Slower expansion, stronger reserves, lower short-term returns, but long-term stability. Someone objected. That approach would disappoint shareholders. Yes, she agreed, but it would protect them. The room leaned in. She did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize the risk. She explained it, step by step, numbers supporting every claim. Daniel watched as the same people who questioned her presence now asked her questions, not politely, seriously. Richard stood nearby, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The partner holding the tablet frowned. You are suggesting we delay growth. I am suggesting we survive it, she replied. A silence followed, not uncomfortable, evaluative. Then something unexpected happened. Daniel spoke. She is right, he said clearly. Every eye turned to him. We chased growth before, he continued. It nearly destroyed this company. I will not make that mistake again. This was the moment. He could feel it, the line that could not be erased. Richard stepped forward. You are choosing caution over confidence, he said. That is not how leaders inspire trust. Daniel did not look away. Leaders inspire trust by telling the truth, he replied, even when it is inconvenient. The room held its breath. The senior partner nodded slowly. We will review the alternative model, he said, immediately. Richard said nothing. He did not need to. His loss of control was evident. As the group dispersed, the energy in the room had changed completely. People no longer whispered about the accountant. They discussed the numbers. Daniel turned to her, his expression steady but intense. You knew this would happen, he said quietly. I knew it might, she replied. Truth always asks for a price. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. I am willing to pay it, he said. She met his gaze, understanding the weight of that choice. Around them, the party continued. But the spectacle no longer mattered. What mattered was what had just been decided in front of everyone who mattered. Daniel had not only defended her, He had aligned himself with her, publicly, permanently, and in doing so, he had turned a temporary arrangement into something far more dangerous, something real. Because now, the room did not question her place beside him. They questioned who would stand against them next. The party ended the way most powerful gatherings did, quietly. Guests said their goodbyes with practiced warmth. Handshakes lingered a second longer than usual. Promises to follow up were exchanged, some sincere, some strategic. The music softened, the lights dimmed. But for Daniel Wright, the night was not over. He stood near the entrance as the last group departed, watching the room empty of everything that had once defined it. Status, noise, performance. When he turned back, she was still there, gathering her coat, composed as ever. The intensity of the evening had not changed her posture. Only her eyes carried the weight of what had happened. "You should leave before it gets too late," he said gently. She nodded. "So should you." They walked out together into the cool night air. The city hummed around them, indifferent to power shifts and boardroom victories. Cars passed. Streetlights glowed. Somewhere nearby, laughter drifted from a late restaurant. For a moment, they stood in silence. "I owe you more than a thank you," Daniel said finally. She looked at him, waiting. "I asked you to stand beside me tonight," he continued. "I told myself it was for one evening, one role, something temporary." She did not interrupt. "But I realized something when Richard challenged us," he said. "I was not defending a decision. I was defending you. And that did not feel temporary at all." She took a breath, slow, measured. "I did not come tonight expecting anything from you," she said. "I came because you trusted me. That mattered." "It still does," he replied. "More than ever." The unspoken boundary they had drawn earlier was gone now, not shattered, released. Daniel hesitated, then spoke with the same clarity that had guided him through crises far worse than this. "I do not want to pretend anymore," he said. "Not to them, not to myself, and not to you." She studied his face, searching for calculation, for strategy. She found none. "What are you asking?" she asked. He answered without hesitation. "To move forward honestly," he said, "without labels, without agreements that hide what we are choosing." She considered that, not emotionally, thoughtfully. "I will not disappear into your life," she said. "I will not become a symbol or a convenience." "I would never ask you to," he replied. "And I will not be protected from consequences," she added. "Standing beside you will cost something." "I know," Daniel said, "and I will stand beside you when it does." That was the moment, not a declaration, not a promise made under pressure, a choice made with open eyes. She nodded. "Then we begin as equals," she said. Daniel smiled, not with triumph, but with relief. As they parted ways that night, there was no dramatic farewell, no grand gesture. Just a shared understanding that something real had replaced something false. The next morning, headlines would speculate. Partners would recalibrate. Richard Hale would plan his next move. But none of that mattered as much as this. A relationship that began as an arrangement had ended as a decision. Not fake, not hidden, not borrowed from expectations. Chosen. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel Wright knew exactly where he stood. Not alone, but beside someone who had never asked for permission to belong.